June 1942, New York Harbor. Men of the 8th Air Force, 10,000 strong, prepared to board a single converted luxury liner for England, just as their fathers did a generation before in the AEF Aero Squadrons. This time, the 97th Bomb Group ground crews, 2 fighter groups and their service units were embarking for England. On her maiden troop ship run across the Atlantic, the Queen Elizabeth carried the vanguard of American air power for the new fight against aggression.
In England, at High Wycombe, we used a girls' boarding school as headquarters. Here, 30 miles from Piccadilly, began the build-up, which eventually made the 8th Air Force larger than the entire U.S. Army had been only 3 years before. As the summer of 1942 rushed by, the work of Generals Duncan, Aker, Spaatz, and the rest of us made the idea a reality. We learned about the air war from the RAF, reaching a degree of cooperation never before equaled by the military forces of 2 great nations.
However, for smashing target Germany, there was disagreement on tactics. The AAF came over prepared for daylight precision bombing, although the British now practiced night area bombing, having suffered unbearably heavy losses in daylight operations. Accordingly, the British Bomber Command picked their targets, trained their crews, fed them lots of carrots, and designed their planes for deadly night attacks. The success of the Wellingtons and Lancasters in attacks against Cologne and the Ruhr during the summer nights of 1942 offered grim evidence of what such tactics could accomplish. These free men were dedicating their lives to attempt the destruction of the economic fabric of an enemy nation in order to save our way of life.
Our first test in tactics came August 17th. It was a critical day for the 8th Bomber Command when we loaded up for the first U.S. raid from England in U.S. planes in daylight. General Ira Aker had told us that the target was the great marshalling yard near Rouen in Nazi-occupied France. There were still plenty of skeptics who predicted dismal results from the first attempt at a daylight mission. Generals Spaatz and Aker had to prove them wrong. Our morale had worn pretty thin from repeated dry runs and public impatience for American action in the European theater. Each guy acted nonchalant, but we were fully aware of the long-range strategic planning that hinged on this particular mission. Maybe we didn't know any better, but we had plenty of confidence. Confidence in our weapons, confidence in our buddies and the way they did their job. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes, just hot rocks. But heroes or not, the flying privates, sergeants, and generals were putting their lives on the line, knowing full well what the odds were. At the controls of one of the lead ships was the old man himself, General Aker, flying a B-17, which someone aptly named Yankee Doodle. As the bombers pulled up their gear, American flyers and 12 American machines assembled over the British countryside, ready to test an American idea in France, high-altitude precision bombing. As England disappeared behind us, we took up battle stations. Our bombardiers and gunners knew that the fate of the mission and the lives of the crew depended on them. We took turns manning the guns, expecting opposition. One of the crew pointed out the city of Rouen, where Joan of Arc had died for the liberation of France. Now, airplanes named Baby Doll, Peggy D, and Yankee Doodle were spoiling to fight for the same thing.
German warning centers, caught by surprise, didn't report the fortresses until they were well on their way to the target.
We made a direct run for a point about 3 miles north of Rouen, and then a slight turn to the right for the bombing approach. All of us flying this first U.S. bomber raid wondered why the sky was clear of enemy fighters and flak. Visibility was excellent, something you don't get for night bombing. All 12 planes dropped a total of 37,000 pounds of bombs. Then we met flak. Daylight gave the Jerrys better targets, too. They pumped anti-aircraft shells smack up to our altitude. Two of our planes collected some flak. Then 40 German fighters made the picture complete. These were no tow targets. These babies throw lead back at you. When we finally shook off the enemy attack, I took a reading. Our group was intact. The mission was far more successful than many of us had dared hope. Even British Bomber Command Air Chief Marshal Harris sent General Acre enthusiastic congratulations. Yankee Doodle, he said, certainly went to town and can stick another well-deserved feather in his cap.
One month later, halfway around the world, events in New Guinea took charge of plans. The Japanese drive toward Port Moresby, one of the few bases we still held north of Australia, threatened to push the Allies into the sea. To stop the enemy, General MacArthur quickly reset the stage for an Allied offensive. He relied on General George Kenney, new commander of Allied Air, who was reorganizing the 5th Air Force with fresh spirit and ideas. The urgency of the situation led him to a daring experiment in air tactics. Moving an army by air had worked in the Carolina maneuvers. Why not in New Guinea? MacArthur had ordered troops rushed into battle. One regiment took 36 hours to go by water. A battalion took 5 weeks by foot. But 60 planes carried an entire Australian infantry battalion in one day. In a little more than an hour, fresh and rested troops arrived in combat zones, ready for immediate duty in the Papuan campaign. With the troops came equipment. By mid-November, 10,000 American and Australian troops had been carried over the mountains. To support the men, air transport brought in supplies at the rate of 2 million pounds a week. They eventually brought in enough men, rations, ammunition, artillery, and equipment to feed and protect themselves, do battle with the enemy, and build airfields. Specially designed airborne equipment, such as pint-sized bulldozers and graders, helped us lay out 6 airstrips in the Kunai Flats. Without native labor paid at local union rates, the work of building grass strips could never have been accomplished. Around Dabadura, they scraped out runways less than 16 miles from the front. Construction completed, fighter units moved in fast to protect the operation. And so the Southwest Pacific Air Forces, directed by veteran Air Leader George Kenney and Fighter Commander Ennis Whitehead, had forged a tactical weapon which helped stem the tide of Japanese aggression in the Papuan campaign.
The one airplane we fighter pilots in New Guinea wanted was the P-38. We had begged Washington to spare us a few of these high-flying Speedy Lightnings. When we finally got them, the ground crews had a big job on their hands. Fuel tanks, superchargers, armament, all required major adjustment or repair.
Enemy mechanics on neighboring fields had fewer planes than the Allies, but numbers in the South Pacific didn't tell everything. Back in October, General Kenney had warned the Pentagon, the Jap is 2 days from the factory to the combat zone, and he may swarm all over me. On December 27th, the Jap tried.
About 11:30 hours, they gave us the alert. Port Moresby had received the word that our radio station at Dabadura had picked up a plot of enemy aircraft approaching the Buna area. We pilots had waited a long time for this moment, and with the help of our crew chief, we got going in a hurry. It had taken more than 3 months to get the P-38s ready for combat. Our maintenance boys had worked hard, and now we were about to put the Lightnings to the test. As part of the 39th Fighter Squadron, we had flown some patrol and escort missions. However, this was to be our first important combat operation. 12 brand new P-38s were being dispatched to intercept an invading force of unknown strength. Both sides were in for a surprise. At 12:10 hours, we sighted the Japs. They were out in force. Separating into 3 flights of 4 each, we got on top at 10,000 feet. The Zeros didn't appreciate the view. Our lead flight peeled off to dive in and break up the formation. With his throttle wide open, this P-38 jockey latched onto a Jap. Then the first lightning struck. One of the eager beavers in action that day was a moon-faced lieutenant by the name of Richard Fogg. This was the first of Bong's 40 victories. Captain Thomas Lynch was also there, and that was a good thing, because the enemy force included more than 28 Zeros and bombers. Tommy Lynch got 2 more that day, making him the 39th Squadron's first ace.
When the score was finally added up, our 12 Lightnings had shot down 11 enemy fighters and bombers. Thus, the P-38 made a dramatic debut in the Southwest Pacific. The tide was turning, but one battle didn't win a war. There were still brutal weeks and months and years of war ahead. Later chapters will show that the enemy had not yet seen, felt, nor imagined the awful might of the air power to be unleashed by the United States Air Force. November 8, 1942, the Mediterranean. 11 months after Pearl Harbor, more than 800 ships engaged in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. The plan called for tactical air support for the ground forces. Some of the air units were ferried from England and the States by carriers.
We had 70 Warhawks on a U.S. flat top, 25 more on a British carrier. We liked this plane. The Curtiss P-40 could carry a 500-pound bomb as easily as a belly gas tank. It was both a fighter and a bomber. Now, inspired by Doolittle's Tokyo raid, land-trained fighter pilots, because their planes were urgently needed, were risking carrier takeoffs to get to Morocco. At 2 and 3 minute intervals, we raced down the short deck and grabbed for air. Felt like someone pulled the runway out from under us awful fast. We cleared the decks and buzzed the carriers for luck. Then the entire group, led by Colonel Bill Momeyer, headed for the already battle-scarred landing fields of French Morocco. General Eisenhower came up for a look-see at our forward command post. Allied forces had rolled over the opposition and moved halfway across North Africa, only to grind to a halt because of weather and the lack of supplies. We were almost within sight of the enemy's big supply ports in Tunisia. However, logistics and mud dictated the decision. On General Eisenhower's order, positions were consolidated and the attack was postponed indefinitely. The mountains, the roads, even the air seemed to ooze with 6 weeks of steady rain. No motor transportation. Wheels went no place. Only a few meager supplies got through. For once, like the foot soldier, air support, the umbrella for our ground forces, was stuck in the mud.
The enemy was in much better shape. They had hundreds of planes operating from permanent all-weather fields. Their veteran, battle-trained Luftwaffe was sure of easy victory over inexperienced American air units. Allied harbors and airfields were primary targets. Air defenses were weak, open for Stuka dive bombing and strafing. After plastering Allied supply harbors, they attacked airfields. Air units doggedly held on while even the ground seemed to rise and burn under repeated attacks. The Allies suffered losses, and even as they rescued their wounded, new and faster ways were improvised to carry casualties to safety. The planes which had brought in high-priority supplies took out higher-priority men. They were attended by flight nurses. With air evacuation, casualties were only hours from hospitals, even home. But wounded men and planes had to be repaired. American ingenuity went to work. Salvaged parts and new ideas made crude gasoline firebombs. The Allies rebuilt their strength.
General Ike had planned strategy with his air, ground, and naval officers. We worked out the best ways of using our combined forces. General Spaatz was named CO of the Northwest African Air Force. Generals Arnold, Royce, and Brereton visited our outfit, the 12th Air Force Fighter Command, run by General Pete Quesada. The brass were helping us get on even terms with the Luftwaffe. Army transport boys tripled railway capacity. A while back, we'd nearly run out of 500-pounders, but now we had plenty. Gasoline rationed at home meant life or death in the desert. The battle for supply was being won. We were getting ready.
Suddenly, on February 14th, Rommel's Africa Corps attacked. At Kasserine Pass, Allied lines stiffened. After 8 days of attack, the Axis initiative was exhausted. It was at this point that Rommel quit his African command.
For the enemy, the situation worsened. Gasoline shortages reduced air operations. Squeezed into a steadily smaller pocket, they prepared to evacuate planes and key personnel to Sicily. About 20 men could escape in a Junker 52.
High above them, the Allies watched and waited. Something big was coming. The German escape plan was put in motion. Near Tunis rose a group of more than 30 heavily armored Me-109 fighters. They were to escort a large fleet of slow-flying 52s. The hop to Sicily was a shuttle run of about 100 miles, less than an hour. 100 strong, the transport stretched in a long line on the deck, headed for their Sicilian sanctuary.
They didn't get very far. As soon as our 57th Fighter Group spotted them, Captain Jimmy Curl's squad of 13 P-40s dove on the enemy to split them up. We had been chasing Germans since July 1942, but we never had a chance like this famous afternoon. Down below, the transports droned on. If their luck held, the Germans might make a getaway. Their luck ran out. Charlies of the long escape line took their chances on getting back to their Cape Bon airdrome. Some of them made it the hard way. When the attack was over, we had destroyed 58 transports and 18 fighters. Lieutenants Duffy, Powers, and Cleveland each clobbered 5 transports. From then on, we sat over German airdromes and dared the Luftwaffe to come up.
But the Axis still had a trump card. The Africa Corps blocked the way to Tunis. The Allies probed, seeking weak spots. Finding some, they shifted forces, building for a breakthrough. Montgomery's army hammered the Africa Corps from the south. Allied artillery tried to give the ground forces a toehold on the corridor to Tunis. But Monty's 8th Army was effectively pinned down by the Africa Corps.
On the morning of May 6th, they called for tactical air support. Weather was good. We had gasoline and bombs, planes and men. We were ready. The Northwest African Tactical Air Force drew up a schedule for an unprecedented wave of air attack. The heavies were first to give depth to the artillery barrage. They ordered us to concentrate on an area 4 miles long by 3.5 miles wide. We had 12th Air Force bomber boys who had started in the muddy fields of Algeria. They were teamed up with 9th Air Force men who had eaten sand all the way from Egypt, 1,500 miles. Before 9 o'clock, we had planned to fly more than 1,000 sorties. Anything that could take off went up to the corridor. Our fighter-bomber boys, including the 57th Group of Cape Bon fame, were about to sweep a road to Tunis. We were using the experience gained in Egypt, smashing Rommel at El Alamein. Then we were only a few. Now we were hundreds, all grouped in a powerful package. General Alexander's armies were anxious for the air attack, which would mean a breakthrough. They didn't have long to wait. We blasted a channel from Medjez El Bab to Tunis. In 2 hours, tanks and infantry had advanced as much as a mile. Resistance began to crack. Firebombs, which we had tested in the Sahara, helped in the big show. The Germans, realizing their desperate situation, retreated to make a last-ditch stand.
Finally, the Allied armies broke through. From here on, Alexander mopped up with fire. At last, the Allies could see Tunis. This was the first flush of victory. A year and a half after Pearl Harbor, only 6 months after the landing. Allied soldiers, tankmen, and airmen were liberators, like the American Marines who had brought peace to North Africa more than a century before. There were salutes to liberty as tyranny disappeared. The citizens of Tunis cheered the crusade for freedom that now had a new champion, Allied air power. 250,000 prisoners proved that Nazi invincibility was a myth. In the German defeat, we learned the strength of joint unified command. Allied air power had destroyed enemy planes, guns, and ships, which paved the way for the final destruction of Hitler's once proud and powerful Africa Corps. As designer of the Tunisian victory, General Eisenhower refused the United Allies, who were at last upon the march. The world had seen the first large-scale application of complete air supremacy. We had battle-tested and developed tactical air support for our ground forces. Later chapters will show the lessons of North African air warfare applied on a global scale with the steadily increasing manpower, plane power, and firepower of the United States Air Force. January 1943, French Morocco. President Roosevelt arrived for the important Casablanca Conference. Prime Minister Churchill and the President were making far-reaching military decisions. With the combined chiefs of staff, they planned global operations. Generals Marshall and Arnold had to build up the United Kingdom base in the face of Nazi plans to infest the Atlantic with submarines. Remembering how their U-boats in 1917 had brought England to her knees, enemy leaders were proud of their 1943 plans for a network of sub-pens. Dr. Tote's engineers now built them with 12-foot concrete tops to make the U-boat nest safe from the Allies' heaviest bombs. The enemy had launched a monstrous U-boat program. 300 by 1942, 900 by 1944. This was to be ruthless undersea warfare, masterminded by Admiral Carl Dönitz.
Back in the United States, our new fighters, like the P-47s, were being shipped to England. Fighter aircraft had become so vital in the war against the Axis, they were given high priorities. Because of the submarine menace, Allied navies escorted all convoys.
By torpedoing the freighters, the enemy tried to cut our Lend-Lease lifeline. Killer subs roaming the North Atlantic in the first half of 1942 had sunk 506 Allied ships. Threatened was the security of Great Britain and our build-up for the air war in Europe. Victorious German submarines were organized in wolf packs. Confronted with this desperate emergency, the U.S. Navy called on the Army Air Forces to assist them in the fight.
Our long-range depth bomb-carrying B-24s were the answer. The ultimate workhorse of our counterattack on the U-boats was the radar-equipped Liberator. These land-based planes were matched against a sneaking killer. The enemy operated almost unimpeded along the vital shipping lanes. Plenty of good hunting. First for them, but after May 1943, for us. Most of us in the 1st Bomber Command and later in the 25 squadrons of the Anti-Submarine Command patrolled wide areas ahead of the convoys. On the deck, we searched immense stretches of the Atlantic hunting for Nazi periscopes. Sub-crews crash dived. Our exploding bombs were clearing the North Atlantic of the Nazi U-boat threat. In those summer months of 1943, the Anti-Submarine Command of the Army Air Forces did a vital job. American fighter planes and badly needed supplies got through.
But in the Far East, on another front, supplies were only trickling through. General Arnold and Allied brass faced the fact that General Chennault's 14th Air Force had to be supplied. Some of his bomber operations had almost ceased. Following Casablanca decisions, Arnold ordered General Bissell to help the ATC India-China wing increase the airlift over the Himalayas.
We called it Flying the Hump. Here over Calcutta, India, we got an idea of how much our sky wagons were slated to carry. There was plenty. tons of food and medicine, tons of gasoline and bombs. Shiploads of them every day. Even this was only a fraction of what would come. First, while still crated, supplies moved overland by train, due north about 800 miles. This was the slow part of the long journey. Then, near the border of Tibet, our supplies were parceled out to several airfields, like Chabwa, largest of the hump terminals. Here, too, although there was plenty of manpower, the transfer methods were primitive. Until more ordnance equipment arrived, the natives helped fight the war with their bare hands. Some of these bombs weighed half a ton. After a year of operation by the 10th Air Force, we had grown from a squadron of 10 borrowed transports to a fleet of 140 high-altitude C-46s and 47s. By 1943, Hump Commander General Edward Alexander began to set records for troops, supplies, and equipment being lifted over the hump. Stretching before us were 500 miles of rough duty. Before it was over, the treacherous hump had cost us 250 transports, 250 cargoes, and 800 airmen. A high price to pay for the privilege to fly over the highest mountains in the world. We flew continuously, some of the time through Jap fighters and treacherous weather. The clouds made pretty pictures, but at 20,000 feet they could mean ice and death. No emergency landing fields among saw-toothed 5-mile-high peaks for us aerial truck drivers. Flying without fighter cover, it was always good to hear we were on the beam and minutes from landing at Kunming, China.
In December of 1943, the India-China wing carried slightly over 6,000 tons. Before the war's end, ATC had airlifted more than 1 million tons of supplies and 1 million troops over the hump. With the help of Army Airways communications system, flights eventually averaged 1 plane every minute and a half. Peak airlift was reached in July 1945. 71,000 tons in 1 month, including a fleet of jeeps. Every 4 tons of gasoline delivered used 3.5 tons to get them there. Despite the hazards and hardships, despite the costs, the Army Air Forces had conquered the hump.
Up our way, in the dismal and dreary Aleutian Islands off Alaska, it was a different sort of war. Around us was the deep, spongy tundra of dead grass and muck. Over us, fog, sleet, and rain for days on end. In spite of it, our 11th Air Force under General Bruce Butler not only protected Alaska from Jap advance, but also struck offensive blows at the enemy. We had a single fighter group of 100 planes, including P-38s. Our force was built around a handful of pilots experienced in Alaskan flying. Colonel Jack Chenault, son of the 14th Air Force commander, led a fighter squadron. Our strength at this time for the entire Alaska-Aleutian area was only 226 operational planes. Luck was with us. On 8 April, the weather cleared and we set out to crush the Nip thrust at Attu, most distant of the island chain. We also helped to box in Kiska, the second enemy-held island, forcing the Japanese to withdraw. From flooded fields, we waded into the enemy. Our small Air Force was guarding the northern approach to America.
In the Pacific, the word went out. General Nathan Twining and his crew were lost on a routine flight. We sent up everything that could fly, but the South Pacific had thousands of miles of ocean. Chances of finding the commanding general of the 13th Air Force were slim. Then, on the morning of January 31st, 5 days and 6 nights after ditching, 2 rubber rafts were sighted. Now the question was, how many had survived exposure in the Coral Sea? The search plane radioed the base. Immediately, 2 Navy Catalina flying boats were ordered out to make contact with the search planes, which directed them to the rafts. After being fished out of the drink, the survivors were rushed back to the nearest base where medical aid awaited them. Although cramped for 130 hours in the small rafts with very little food and hardly any water, their morale stayed high, thanks to General Twining. All 15 aboard the Lost B-17 had survived a rugged experience. Twining and his crew were part of a small army of men whose lives had been saved by the air-sea rescue services of the Army and Navy.
General Twining rejoined our theater commander, General Millard Harmon, in planning new operations up the Solomon Island chain. We had fresh B-24s, and in July were able to launch our 37-day campaign to Jap-held Munda Field on New Georgia Island. Some of us had taken off from hard-won Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, which American men had bought and paid for with their lives. The blow we were about to deliver to Munda, we hoped, would make their sacrifices worthwhile. We were finally nearing the island. As soon as we made our approaches to Munda, jungle-hopping medium bombers went after the Jap airdrome and its defenses. Then our liberators opened up. Stubbornly, the enemy held on until 171 aircraft dropped 145 tons of bombs in a half hour. It was the heaviest air bombardment yet cooked up in the South Pacific in one day. By the time resistance had ended, the enemy had lost 350 aircraft. In only 9 days, the Allies rushed the strip into operating condition. P-40s were the first to land, followed by heavy bombers which could easily be carried on the coral runways. Warhawks helped protect the base as we rapidly built it into a key for the Solomon Islands. In a few weeks, traffic exceeded that of any field in the South Pacific, reaching the peak of 564 aircraft in one day.
The Munda campaign had shown the success of a new tactic, bypassing heavily defended enemy points and gaining air superiority behind them. General MacArthur described the island-hopping campaign as a series of battles for airfields. In the South Pacific, as elsewhere in all global operations, the Allies had proved the might of air power. Air power had helped clear submarines from the Atlantic. Air power had conquered the hump. Air power had made Pacific island hopping possible. Later chapters will show these daring tactics applied to smashing the Axis itself, as more men and weapons were added to the mighty arsenal of the United States Air Force. 1943, Army Air Force graduation exercises at Tyndall Field, Florida. From the start, France and 30 other Allied nations sent many of their airmen to the United States to learn how to fly, to fire a gun, or check an engine. In fact, the Air Training Command used about 1/3 of its facilities for this program to help build the United Nations Air Team. As one product of the AAF educational effort, which developed into the greatest training program in all history, French cadet Henri Chevanier was awarded gunner's wings. Pilot wings went to another cadet whose entire class was destined to join the Chinese-American composite wing of the 14th Air Force under the command of General Claire Chennault. And so the young men from Great Britain, Netherlands, East Indies, Central and South America, by graduating in the United States and by fighting in Europe and Asia, demonstrated the Army Air Force's unique contribution to the total war effort of the United Nations.
Of the 475 training command bases we had, The Officer Candidate School of the AAF at Miami Beach, Florida, was devoted to turning out administrative officers. We wanted men from every walk of life who could handle responsibilities. By the end of 1943, we knew the AAF was going to have more than 158,000 planes and more than 2 million specialists around the world.
Only 23 out of every 1,000 applicants were finally chosen as candidates. Meet the cream of the crop.
The man on the left was the National Intercollegiate High Jump champ. The one on the right served under Chenault in China with the American Volunteer Group.
Elmer E. Meadows was once the world's champion pole vaulter. He won the 1936 Olympic title in Berlin.
The fellow on the left was rescued off Corregidor, the other a symphony conductor.
D.R. Delano, fifth cousin to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
A trapeze artist with Ringling Brothers Circus. On the right, the mayor of Glen Cove, Long Island.
This former Austrian attorney spent quite a while in a Nazi concentration camp.
A gunner with the RAF, and a Broadway playwright.
Gilbert Roland of Hollywood. He used to have a mustache, remember?
These men wore the Order of the Purple Heart. One got his at Pearl Harbor, the other in the Battle of Verdun.
Robert Meservey. You knew him as Robert Preston.
2 tigers, one from Burma, a member of the Flying Tigers, on the right, catcher for the Detroit Tigers.
This man was cited for bravery at Pearl Harbor.
First bombardier to touch Midway, Wake, and Guam. Right, the AAU light heavyweight champion.
William H. Jordan, bombardier in the Battle of Midway. Those medals are for sharpshooting.
The fellow with glasses was an ecologist. He worked for the United States Department of Agriculture. For 14 years, he had done research with a sugar beet leafhopper. In fact, he knew more about the sugar beet leafhopper than anyone else in the world. The other fellow was a champion high jumper. Because Hap Arnold knew that Hitler wouldn't wait for us to build a ground officers' school, he had General Weaver lease 300 Miami Beach hotels, and we were in business almost at once. In hotels like the Governor, we housed our students. Better than a tent, but no vacation. We gave each prospective officer a reliable chambermaid, himself. No wrinkles in those beds, blankets tight enough to bounce a coin. Shoes shined and lined up, dresser drawers staggered and open. Socks rolled, personal articles arranged according to student order. Student orders, the Bible. No dust in this room. Bed made like the book says. We allowed them 7 hours sleep. They were lucky if they managed 5. They studied instead. Each man's clothes were hung in the same order. All buttons were buttoned, each and every button. No drop of water in sink or tub. All bright work polished, highly polished.
So were the men, all spit and polish, and their spirit was high. During the 12 weeks, they crammed in enough schoolwork to equal a year at college. In concentrated education, they studied chemical warfare, air and naval intelligence, administration, aircraft identification, mess management, supply, military law, and 27 more subjects. At West Point, many of these courses took a year of study, but America was at war.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Away, break!
After improving their minds, we improved their bodies. This was all part of the Air Force X-ray machine that revealed washouts as well as leaders.
Finally, it was graduation. Everyone came out for the show. The guest speaker was the old man himself, General Hap Arnold. He flew down from Washington just to address the class. That was quite an honor. Today, the cream of the crop had a right to be proud. This cross-section of America had been through something, and they had made the grade. After 3 grueling months, they earned that commission in the Army of the United States. For a few of the men, there were special honors. A sense of achievement. Some won awards for sports, but every graduate now had poise and confidence. OCS turned out leaders of men who could share the nation's responsibilities. For many, the oath marked the start of a new career in the service of the nation. But in spite of the joy of the graduation moment, the Air Force would have been nothing without the devotion, anger, and bitter pride of the great American people engaged in a war for freedom. Love and pride were as much a part of the Air Force as money and planes. Now, after a desperate year and a half of war, the AAF was about to fulfill an historic and decisive mission. In another part of the world, on the Mediterranean, plans for Operation Corkscrew moved ahead as the British 1st Division convoys prepared to embark from ports in Africa for Pantelleria. The island, with underground hangars and natural defenses, was regarded by Mussolini as the Italian Gibraltar. General Jimmy Doolittle warned his men that conquest of the volcanic rock might prove expensive. The enemy had 900 planes within range and 80 major gun emplacements on the island. Briefings for 9th Air Force fighter pilots, now attached to the Northwest African Tactical Force, were carefully guided by General Louis Brereton. The all-out air attack on the island had been recommended by his boss, General Carl Spaatz.
For Operation Corkscrew, the brass gave us slightly more than 1,000 fighting planes of every type. They felt our combined air forces had at last grown to a point where we could chance the first Allied attempt to conquer enemy territory essentially by air action. According to plan, for 18 continuous days during the first phase of the campaign, we had battered the fascist fortress with heavy raids. Photo Recon reported that our work was effective. Mussolini's Gibraltar was now set up for the knockout punch. In a couple of weeks, our boys in the Northwest African Air Forces were changing the concepts of war. From African bases, where American air power had achieved co-equal status with land power, Phase 2 of Operation Corkscrew got underway on 6 June. As our heavies joined the show, the plan called for an around-the-clock assault to continue with growing intensity for 5 more days. The Allied command was about to unleash the full force of its air power. In all, 1,100 planes were participating in today's climactic assault. They were prepared to drop 1,571 tons of bombs. That meant better than 23 tons of destruction per acre. High on the target list were Pantelleria's shore batteries. To the air attack, the enemy's flak guns were inaccurate, but they kept trying for a lucky hit. In 6 days and nights, we had dropped almost 5,000 tons of high explosives, achieving a concentration on military objectives greater than any we had ever attempted. Twice, the island was offered a chance to surrender. When Pantelleria showed no sign of quitting, B-17s were ordered to resume the bombing. It was then that our planes spotted a white flag flying from Semaphore Hill. Allied Allied air forces had bombed the island into submission.
As a result, the invasion fleet met practically no opposition. Regarding the operation, a British Joint Committee reported, in effect, active resistance on Pantelleria had ceased when our amphibious forces arrived. Not a Tommy or a GI got his feet wet. From here on, it was a routine operation. Immediately, the Allies began to prepare the island for its part in the invasion of Sicily. For the second time, Axis might was reduced to rubble, and strutting supermen became beggars with surrender flags. Troops quickly poured ashore. They were amazed at the extent of the destruction. The remains of the enemy's air defense was strewn along the beaches, while the only landing casualty was a British infantryman who was nipped by a local jackass. By the time of the Sicilian campaign, Pantelleria had become a full-fledged Allied air base. The Allies could now place a strong defensive air arm over the Sicilian Narrows. The sea route from Gibraltar to Alexandria could be kept open. Operation Corkscrew not only paid dividends, but because it proved the power of air bombardment to force a defended area to capitulate, it was destined to become a military classic in the history of the United States Air Force. Dawn, August 17th, 1943, England. On the first anniversary of their operations against Fortress Europe, the 8th Bomber Command prepared 376 B-17s for the two most critical targets on their list, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg, both deep in Germany.
What an anniversary. Just a year ago, we flew that first mission to Rouen. 12 B-17s flying 56 miles to target. Now we were taking 376 fortresses 500 miles into Germany. Never had we prepared for so rough a mission. In 1943, the AAF was still growing up. The Luftwaffe had already reached its peak. But our boys taking their battle folders knew it. By the time we turned in our personal stuff, it was well understood that the projected doubleheader would bring on a large-scale and costly air battle. In chapels all over England, most of the men turned to their ministers, rabbis, or priests. Getting into the trucks, we didn't dream that August 17th was being written into air history. Not only because of us, there were other soldiers in the skies. This was the same day that Sicily fell to the Allies. The same day that the RAF bombed Peenemünde, the V-2 rocket plant. The same day that General Kenny's B-25s destroyed 200 Jap planes at Wewak in 8 minutes. And this day, our double mission involved the deepest penetration ever attempted into Germany, and the largest bomber force to be dispatched to date. We knew that as we went further into Germany, we'd hurt her more. But we also knew we'd have to pay a higher price for admission. And now the last briefing as the pilots rechecked the details of the mission with their crews. Individuals no longer existed. We were now 10-man teams, and on our teamwork would depend our success and perhaps our lives. Action against Schweinfurt got underway. The Regensburg task forces had just hit their target. A vast and intricate machine of destruction had been set in motion. Behind these modern warriors were weeks of high command planning. Now crewmen took care of routine duties. Ahead of us were 4 hours of rugged action. Our guns were going to be especially important today, At the briefing, they told us we'd have help from short-range fighters and 8th Air Support mediums. The fighters were supposed to take us about halfway. The mediums were to bomb diversionary targets. But for the worst part of the trip, we'd be on our own. Finally, after a few hours' delay due to bad weather, 2,300 men counted the seconds.
So far, American bombers had never been stopped. Although German defenses had stiffened, American formations had not been prevented from reaching their objective once they responded to the green takeoff signal. As always, each thundering run was an epic of suspense until 30 tons of bombs, plane, and men were lifted from the earth. The leader of the first wing, Colonel William Gross, swept in a huge circle around the field. Gradually, the second and third bombers edged into position. The sky quickly filled with stately fortresses sliding through space. But as soon as they got into formation over the British fields, they were picked up by German radar. Across the channel, the tentacles of the enemy's locator system, having touched the flying fortresses, now pinpointed them in space. Luftwaffe experts accurately plotted the American course, altitude, and speed, and promptly informed their fighter control. Immediately at dozens of Nazi aerodromes from as far north as Denmark to down around Paris, German fighter units began to send up everything they had. Their order was, intercept and destroy the oncoming fortresses. The answer to the increasing Allied bomber offensive was this stepped-up German fighter strength. Waves of opposition screamed off the map of Europe.
In spite of the Luftwaffe, Allied planners selected our targets according to Allied Air Force priorities. That's why, merely 3 hours after the 4th Bomb Wing had paralyzed the Nazis' Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, we in the 1st Bomb Wing were on our way to strike Schweinfurt in the face of an aroused enemy. As we began to run into flak, our gunners could feel the entire German Air Force warming up. Flying in enemy territory, we felt like goldfish in a bowl, waiting for the attack. Strict radio silence was maintained while trained eyes searched the sky.
Luftwaffe unleashed every trick. The B-17 suffered the most savage blows since the war began.
we knocked 20 bombers out of the sky on the road to Schweinfurt, we never broke formation. Despite the ferocity of the attack, which extended all the way to and from the target, we pressed forward. Our guns kept burning the enemy out of the sky. Approaching the bomb run began the most critical defensive period. Now we divided into smaller groups, sacrificing our mutual defensive firepower to bomb the target most efficiently. The crucial moment. The moment around which the entire mission revolved was now in the steady hands of our bombardiers. Each bomber was now committed. No more evasive action until bombs away. At this time, the formations were most vulnerable to attack. It didn't matter. We had a job to do on Schweinfurt. We had 400 tons of high explosives to deliver. After getting 80 hits on the two main ball-bearing plants, we could defend ourselves again, at least to the extent of evasive action against flak and fighter attack. But the main idea now was to get home fast.
At the British landing fields, word on the sky battle was out. Red flares were expected. That meant wounded aboard. These planes had priority in landing. Many of the fortresses themselves were crippled. A few came in with feathered props or with knocked-out landing gear. After struggling home at housetop altitude, one B-17 with wounded aboard was committed to a crash landing. Ship was My Prayer.
The anniversary battles lost us more men and aircraft in a single day than the 8th Bomber Command had lost in our first 6 months of operations over Europe. We who carried the war 500 miles to the enemy's industrial heart knew better than anyone how expensive it was. We had lost 60 bombers and their crews.
What happened this 17th day of August, year 1943, was a testament to American men with modern weapons and a very old idea, fighting for freedom. On this day, high-altitude bombers engaged in their greatest and, from the point of view of loss, their most disastrous air battle to date. Nonetheless, the results justified the price we paid. Out of these trials by fire, there did emerge from the struggle one of the most polished and powerful instruments of warfare ever assembled. This force of men and planes, this accumulation of skill and experience, became the power and might of the United States Air Force. (1943). Burma. 2 years after Pearl Harbor, General Joseph Stilwell opened his long-delayed campaign for a ground supply route to China.
with a handful of Americans and American-equipped Chinese divisions, he was advancing to meet the Japanese Imperial Army and drive them out of Burma. Stilwell had molded the once pulpy mass of ill-fed peasant soldiers into skilled, tough fighters, able to meet the Japanese on equal terms. But this Allied penetration, named Operation Saucy, was unusually difficult. The men had to fight the Japs and the disease-infested jungle in order to stay alive.
As a transport pilot, my job was to fly help to Vinegar Joe's army. He was entirely dependent on our 10th Air Force for ammo and medicine, clothing and food. Stillwell's men marked their drop zones as they inched steadily closer to Jap positions. The progress of an army depended on a co-pilot's signal. General Stratemeyer had warned the Pentagon. The only way we can supply any force that advances into Burma is by airdrop. That's why when Stilwell started this offensive southward from Lido, he had air supply for his advancing troops. Our supply pushers developed bomb sight precision. For the past year, split-second timing had meant survival to lonely air warning outposts perched on jungle-covered ridges in the Naga Hills. Air supply and the successful teamwork of the Eastern Air Command now made it possible for the Burma campaign to drive ahead.
But in the jungle, the mission that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had given General Stilwell was one of the toughest in the war. He had a most difficult physical problem of great distances, almost impassable terrain. Cutting their own trail, Stilwell's army stumbled along at barely a mile an hour. The Chinese jockeyed for a frontal position, flanked by other Allied forces. It was a two-pronged drive to split the Jap wedge and reopen the Burma Road. The advance by the Chinese army into the Hukung Valley was the most ambitious campaign yet staged on the end of a thin airborne supply line. With amazing vigor, Stilwell carried on. Wounded men, the enemy, and the jungle were his obstacles. Quick evacuation of casualties could hasten the campaign, cut it down to months instead of years. But how can you get a wounded man out of the jungle fast?
In the CBI, a plane we called the Sky Jeep was the answer. It was both a light transport and an ambulance. Able to operate from temporary airfields, we achieved a high degree of mobility and secrecy. In 1 month, 10 sergeant-driven Sky Jeeps carried out more than 700 casualties. With one of Stilwell's wounded soldiers aboard, the Last Chance got ready for takeoff. The Burma campaign made full use of air power, from transports and bombers to an armada of Sky Jeeps. Upwards of 100,000 men were constantly supplied and evacuated by air. Eventually, the Allies were able to drive the enemy out of Burma.
Down at Allied bases south of New Guinea's Owen Stanley Mountains, another army of men and planes prepared for the first Allied paratroop drop in the Pacific. It was designed to cut off a large force of Japs at Nadzab in northeast New Guinea. Early in the morning of 5 September, 1,700 sky jumpers in full battle array climbed aboard a fleet of General George Kenney's 5th Air Force transports. At 08:25 hours, the first C-47s rolled down the runway. Within 15 minutes, 3 flights totaling 79 planes took off. In all, 302 aircraft slid into place and, like a mighty procession, paraded toward Nadzab. The pilots gradually dropped from altitudes of 3,500 feet down to 500 feet. So far, no trace of the enemy, but no chances were being taken. A squadron of low-flying attack bombers laid columns of smoke on the floor of the Nadzab Valley. Once over the target area, the transports formed into 3 columns, each with 32 planes. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment and a battalion of Australians tumbled out to make their first drop, and with success. Nadzab, the Japs' back door, was left open. With Allied forces firmly installed in northeast New Guinea and the Solomons, General MacArthur and Admiral Halsey could now threaten Rabaul, the enemy's main supply center in this critical area.
For 3 days in a row, we were alerted for a strong, low-level attack to knock out Rabaul on New Britain Island. At forward staging bases in New Guinea, our B-25s waited for weather as we got ready. We were going to depend on our gunners to neutralize enemy planes in Ack-Ack in order for the rest of us to smash the airdromes around Rabaul and then destroy the concentration of military shipping in Simpson Harbor.
Ever since January 1942, units of the 5th Air Force had continually blasted Rabaul. Today, November 2nd, 1943, the briefing officer announced that the 8th Photo Squad flying recon over Simpson Harbor had seen 7 destroyers and 20 merchant vessels. At the airdromes, they had counted 237 planes. This sounded like a rough mission. At the fighter pilot briefings, P-38 boys were given details of the plan that required perfect coordination between bomber and fighter elements. Surprise and timing were the mainsprings of the battle plan that the successful air campaigner General Kenny now put in motion. Briefings over, 5 squadrons of Mitchells, a force of 80 medium bombers, were boarded and revved up. Shortly after 1000 hours, the tower gave them the go-ahead, and the bombers got underway. Then the fighters got ready. From 6 squadrons of Lightnings, 2 squadrons had orders to sweep Simpson Harbor, 4 to blanket the land batteries. In all, 80 Lightnings scrambled off.
Good flying weather, our bombers held their formations as we headed toward Rabaul. Leader of our shipping strike forces was a veteran of 80 strafing missions, 25-year-old attack group commander Major John Hennebrey. Once over the Solomon Sea, the Kenny plan went into high gear. As we scanned the skies, we spotted what we were looking for: enemy aircraft. Our Lightning swept in ahead of the bombers to clear the area. When 2 Zeros challenged Captain Ralph Bills and his wingman, he opened up. First, Bills didn't connect, so he got his 38 on the Jap's tail, and the battle turned into a chase. Paving the way for the attack, our Lightnings ran into more than 60 interceptors. The P-38 escort, led by Major Gerald Johnson and Captain Richard Bong, flew interference for the anti-aircraft neutralizing forces. They attacked swiftly and with a double intent of covering the B-25s and destroying the enemy. Our surprise visit gave the Jap pilots at Lakunai Airdrome short warning before the speedy P-38s peeled off and dropped their bombs. we dove in on aircraft parked on hard stands and revetments. 3 minutes later, 4 bombardment squadrons approached the target area. Assigned to neutralize shore anti-aircraft positions, the B-25s peeled off. Parachute fragmentation bombs, because of their delayed explosions, permitted us to get down low and blast the enemy out of their hiding places. It was this complete neutralization which finally enabled our striking forces to make dangerous mast-high runs over Simpson Harbor. At Rabaul this day, we bombed 24 enemy ships. We scraped 17. Our bombers destroyed 52 enemy aircraft. Our fighters claimed 42 shot out of the sky. The cost, 45 American flyers, 17 American planes. In the space of 12 minutes, a formidable Japanese sea and air armada was attacked and decisively defeated.
After 2 years of war, the Japanese strategic plan had been fatally upset. But the Allies knew the enemy was not yet destroyed. Her armies and navies still controlled conquered territory. General Arnold told the world, "There are many roads that lead right to Tokyo, and we're not going to neglect any of them." Relentlessly, the Allied attack had to continue, spearheaded by the striking power of the United States Air Force. October 9th, 1943, England, 8th Air Force Bomber Command. Inside the operations war room, nerve center of the vast organization which was directing daily attacks against target Germany, the commanding general staff stood ready. Like the bombers on nearby fields, they waited for General Fred Anderson's briefing. Time for decision was at hand. Tomorrow's targets were about to be selected. The general relied on a mountain of information from his intelligence and weather experts.
What's the weather prospect today, Major?
It looks like most of Germany will be pretty good, sir. But we have a warm front approaching from down here, which we do not expect to affect the bases until late in the evening.
How's the weather at Anklam?
At Anklam, sir, we expect 2 to 5 tenths of low cloud and small amounts of middle and high cloud above 18,000 feet. Visibility 6 to 8 miles.
How about Marienburg?
At Marienburg, 2 to 4 tenths of low cloud, little or no middle or high cloud. Visibility 6 to 8 miles.
What will it be at Danzig and Gdynia?
At Danzig and Gdynia, sir, 2 to 5 tenths of low cloud, 2 to 4 tenths of high cloud above 23,000 feet. Visibility in there about 5 miles, sir.
Give me the map of Anklam and the picture of the aircraft factory there.
Yes, sir.
All right, Marienburg, the Focke-Wulf factory.
Yes, sir.
We will attack Marienburg with 2 combat wings, Anklam with 2 combat wings, the shipyards at Danzig with 2 combat wings, and the port facilities at Gdynia with 2 combat wings. That will require a maximum effort.
Maximum effort. This field order was flashed to 150,000 men and 600 aircraft.
the mighty 8th Air Force was alerted. Because most of the bombers were going deeper than ever before, the plan was for the task forces to spread and thus divert German fighter defenses. Each route, though aimed at a vital target in the enemy's industrial heart, was carefully plotted to minimize enemy flak and fighter interference. General Bob Williams' 1st Division tackled their part in the mission.
Control point here at 0 hour. Another control point here for the northern unit, 0 plus 40 minutes. The other from that timing, where will that put our northern force at the time that our southern force hits the IP? The northern force should be about the east coast of Denmark at that time, sir. It looks like we're going to catch all the fighters on the southern force, aren't we? Looks very much that way, sir. I think we'd better bend that route around so it's headed towards Berlin. If we can pin those German fighters down in Berlin until we can get started home, they'll never catch us.
Meanwhile, General Hodges' 2nd Division got ready.
Danzig, eh? That's fine. How many ships will we have tomorrow?
Well, sir, if you recall, General, on our last mission we had heavy battle damage, and now all those aircraft are repaired yet.
Call up the wing commanders and have them put pressure on the groups to get their maintenance crews to work on these ships tonight and get every possible airplane on the line in the morning.
The planning continued at General Russ Wilson's 3rd Division.
Looks pretty good, sir. We're going to be right over a lake there for a good checkpoint at the turn. We're going in against the sun. The sun will be at our back, sir.
Defenses at the target.
Major Frost, what about the flak defenses?
Sir, the upper target, 24 guns. That approach is good. The lower target isn't defended by heavy guns.
No heavy guns whatever in Marienburg.
None, sir.
At combat wing operations, Colonel Kessler's unit plotted airplane takeoffs and assembly.
Field order requires that we provide the 2nd Combat Wing and the 2nd Air Task Force. 89th Group will lead, 81st Group will be high, and the 63rd Group will be low.
That means that Colonel Whitten will lead the combat wing on this mission?
That'll be fine.
Planning was turned into action. Pilots came for the word in the briefing rooms. For some, it was their first mission. Most of us were veterans. Everyone was checked in, no strangers allowed. What went on here could mean life or death in the air later. In a few minutes, we'd learn the nature, locale, and route of the day's mission. Who was carrying the ball and what protective tactics we'd use. Once everyone settled down, the briefing started.
The target for the day is Anklam. Specifically, you are to destroy the Arado factory.
This group is meeting a formation to Marienburg today.
The 80th will be high group and the 764th will be low group.
The commanding general of Bomber Command asked us to put out a special effort today, so let's give it to him.
The group COs always had a few words.
Men, the going's going to be rough. You're going to have to throw your necks in there and stay in there and pitch every minute.
Now, gentlemen, this is the type of target you don't want to have to go back after the second time.
Remember that your biggest enemy is still the single-engine fighter plane. Now, you bombardiers, take your time in going in on your releases.
Now, if you get in any trouble up in this area, remember you can always board a squeeze. Get on it, leave the country. And it's close over there.
Could be rough. Don't think it'll be too bad. And whether it's easy or rough, I'll be sitting out in front, taking the whole works in.
It was quite a show. After 3 hours, we had penetrated deep into Germany. And so far, our tactics had paid off. We were getting through. Our liberators and fortresses followed the timetable of our flight plan in tight formations. As we approached our target, some of the Germans intercepted. enemy fighters and enemy flak didn't stop us from getting to our objectives. Anklam, Gdynia, Danzig, Marienburg. All work in these German war plants came to a sudden and violent stop.
Sir, in addition to Anklam, which was attacked at 1142, Marienburg was attacked at 1305. Danzig was attacked at 1307.
On bombing the target, the group leader instantly called the Bomber Command. This command, in turn, promptly informed Ira Eaker, the commanding general of the 8th Air Force.
General Baker, I have the additional information. I reported to you that Anklam was attacked. All primaries were attacked. We received strike messages on all primaries. Danzig at 1307, Marienburg at 1305, and Gdynia at 1311. Yes, sir, I'll advise you as soon as they land.
This was a signal for the 8th Fighter Command to put into action their part of the battle plan. At the British bases, more than 150 P-47s began to take off to escort the returning task forces. The Thunderbolts joined up with the bombers north of Holland. Immediately, enemy fighter activity ceased. From now on, it was a milk run.
Back at the bases, 145,000 men sweated out the mission. All over the field, at dispersal areas, the control tower, the Red Cross, everyone wondered how many would return. Finally, the Marienburg task force was sighted, more than 90 strong. Only 2 bombers missing from this group. The other task forces to Gdynia, Danzig, and Anklam had suffered stiffer enemy pounding. Tactics had called for them to attract enemy fighters away from the main target. It was a calculated risk, but compared to Schweinfurt, losses were cut in half.
One by one, the bombers set down. At long last, the flyers had returned home. Happy that they got back, our gunners celebrated their victories. Nearly 150 enemy planes destroyed. Although tension eased for the ground crews, the job of the flyers wasn't done.
Before the airmen could rest, they were rushed to interrogation while their impressions and memories were still fresh. Every bit of information was needed for future planning. 3 hours and 21 minutes ago, these men were over Anklam.
What time did you go over the target?
At 11:43 hours. We went in at 12,000 feet.
Did you get your bombs on the target?
Yeah.
What about enemy fighter opposition?
Well, that's something we could have asked.
Really? Well, let's get some of the details. Where did it begin, Paul?
Well, they first jumped at the 10:30 there just off the Danish coast.
And how long did the attack continue?
They stayed with us to the target and until 13:27. Then at 13:45 we had another group attack and stayed until 14:05. We had a couple more attacks, and the last one was at 15:26 just off the Danish coast coming out.
What type of enemy aircraft did you encounter?
Well, from what I could see from the tail, they threw the book at us. FW-19s, ME-109s, 110s, 210s, Dorniers, even Ju-87s and 88s.
I knocked down 2. They were making attacks about 5 o'clock level.
Yeah, I saw them. One of them blew up in the air, and the other one went down in flames.
Were any other guns firing at these planes? No, sir. These were my babies.
Interrogation over, the cold facts were collected. Strike photos were processed. They revealed the primary target, the Marienburg Focke-Wulf aircraft plant, almost completely destroyed. Only yesterday it had been turning out half of Germany's FW-190 fighters. In fact, the concentration of bomb bursts was so great that General Hap Arnold called it the finest example of precision bombing on record.
up to this time. Success was the result of scientific planning by an Air Force which knew its business. For 2 more years, the lessons of these maximum effort, long-distance missions were to be applied on an even greater scale over Germany and then Japan, with the combined bomber and escort fighter strength of the growing United States Air Force. August 1943, Canada. At the First Quebec Conference, Allied chiefs were planning new strategy. Expecting European victory in a year, the Allies now marshaled their forces against Japan. The president knew that distances had put a premium on long-range air power. To strike Japan, he had a new weapon. Roosevelt promised 200 B-29 Superforts by March 1944.
Inside the Chateau Frontenac at the Joint Chiefs Conference, General Arnold proposed to pierce the inner zone of Japan's homeland with the unbuilt bombers from bases to be erected in China. It was a bold plan. At the time of the Quebec Conference, we only had 11 superforts. Hap Arnold's motto was to become famous. He announced, "The difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes a little longer." There were only 7 months to keep the promise. It was a race with time.
We aircraft workers came from all walks of life. A few of us had built planes in World War I. We were a part of the strength of America, now working for Boeing, Bell, and Martin. Their factories had sprung up across the country, in Georgia, Kansas, Nebraska, in the state of Washington. Things had certainly changed. In 20 years, America's aviation industry had come of age. Unskilled workers became highly productive because the cranes and jigs and tools were so designed. Boeing engineers helped us make a new wing that could carry more weight faster and higher than any we'd ever built. In each plane, there were 55,000 numbered parts. Thousands of miles of wiring, 1 million rivets. From its transparent nose to its tail, this was a complicated machine. Nevertheless, the Air Force ordered the assemblies like pieces for a giant jigsaw puzzle. By December, only 4 months after the president's promise, we put together 35 superforts. Then, every hour of every day, identical miracles of modern machinery were brought together. We workers witnessed an inspiring sight, a welding of vision and reality, of free men and their need for peace, of national defense and American industry. Building the Superfort was the climax in the history of man's conquest of the air. Bring to reality the dreams of Billy Mitchell and Frank Andrews, the plans of Hap Arnold and Tooey Spots. Thus, the 99-foot-long aerial giant, spreading 141-foot wings, was born. By the end of January, 142 superforts were accepted. 3/4 of America's promise, and our pipelines were full. Here were 65 tons of Fighting Fury, the biggest, fastest, and most powerful bomber in the world. Now our sons and brothers could take the B-29 to war.
In sharp contrast, halfway around the world in China, the other half of the Superfort miracle unfolded. armies of laborers were building a network of air bases almost by hand. These lean, sinewy Chinese, measuring their work by the remaining Earth pyramids, wrote a magnificent chapter in the saga of the Superfort, 2,000 years after their ancestors had built the Great Wall for the defense of China. Here were the same primitive methods: baskets and hoes, muscles and goodwill, and wheelbarrows which squeaked to keep imaginary devils away. With the machinery of only their million hands, stone by stone was patiently set. A modern Chinese wall was taking shape. Under the direction of 26 American officers and enlisted men, and at a cost of $150 million, 1,000-men gangs, following their own flagmen, rolled out 4 great air bases.
April 24th became a day for us in the 20th Bomber Command to remember. General Saunders and Colonel J. Carman led the B-29 parade into Chengdu. Nearly all the immense airfields were ready for business. They had been built in only 3 months. Here was our Superfort. It had hopped the Atlantic, Africa, and India. It flew from Kansas to China in a week. It didn't seem possible, but only a year and a half after the first experimental B-29 was flown, a fleet of American aerial dreadnoughts were arriving in China. Next stop, Japan. Within 10 days, our Asiatic strength was 130 superforts. Directed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff because of our long range and power, we were the first units of the 20th Air Force. The President's promise was being kept. With more superforts on the way, the runway builders never stopped. In China, a land of miracles, unskilled hands were pounding out a path to victory.
Meanwhile, in Japan, 1,500 miles to the east, other hands had forged a modern war machine. Geared for war since 1928, their production rolled on. Like the Germans, they believed their empire invulnerable. Since Pearl Harbor, steel capacity had doubled. 1/3 was hammered into ships, ships to exploit conquered lands, ships to support far-flung military forces. Though suffering from shipping sunk by the Allies, Japan maintained the world's 3rd largest merchant fleet with continued launchings. Their island empire with Korea and Manchuria, connected by an efficient merchant marine, formed an industrial empire 3 times larger than Germany. Their ground forces had expanded to 5 million fanatics, nearly 4 times their strength at the time of Pearl Harbor. As the conquerors of 500 million people, they had to be stopped.
By June, our bases in China were working around the clock. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had ordered an attack on Japan. How many bombers could be sent? Our answer was 50. Not enough. Get at least 70. A maximum effort was necessary. It would relieve enemy pressure in East China, help the invasion of Saipan, our future Pacific base. Our target was Yawata, Japan's heavily guarded Pittsburgh. Yawata, which made 1/5 of all Jap steel. General Wolfe was winning the big gamble. His idea to train our crews while we tested the experimental B-29 was putting both men and planes in combat 6 months sooner. We were doing the impossible. 68 superforts become airborne. Almost the entire force ordered for this historic mission. The lead ship named Lady Hamilton. We followed General Blondie Saunders and his pilot, Colonel Howard Engler. We followed the Marines who landed on Saipan this morning. We headed out high over the Yangtze River. Guided by our navigators, we began the long hop across the Yellow Sea. Japan. The enemy was waiting. Up came heavy, bursting flak. Nearly 5 miles below lay the sprawling mills that armed the Japs. Jimmy Doolittle had said we'd be back. And we were. 2.5 years after Pearl Harbor, our superforts had struck Japan. Land-based planes dropped bombs through clouds on Yawata. Damage was done to the Kokura arsenal. Punishment to the steel industry was not extensive, but the B-29 Blitz was underway.
A global bomber and a global air force were in operation. The beginning of the end of the Japanese Empire was underscored in exploding bombs that reminded the Japs of Pearl Harbor. The growing systematic waves of destruction had started. From China and later from Saipan, the Allies were forging a huge nutcracker to crush the enemy. General Arnold's determined order, make 'em the biggest, gun 'em the heaviest, and fly 'em the farthest, was carried out. He warned the enemy, no part of the Japanese Empire is now out of our range. No war factory too remote to feel our bombs. The battle for Japan is now underway with full speed ahead. (1943) Italy. The Allies had won a toehold on Europe. After bloody Salerno, prime objective was Foggia, an array of Nazi-Italian airfields strategically close to the heart of Germany.
Early the next year, General Spaatz came to Foggia to inspect us. Nate Twining's new outfit, the 15th Air Force. General Aker was taking over command of the Mediterranean Theater. The brass met to plan air support, the keystone for Allied armies on the road to Rome.
Winter rains made sunny Italy a sea of mud. Taking 61 days to travel 8 miles, the Fifth Army inched its way up the boot. Their order was, push north through the German lines and liberate Rome.
Every day at 0600, the 12th Air Force reported for tactical missions. Fighting the same winter weather, we were handed the grim job of blasting a hole through the Gustav Line. We fighter pilots were the sword point of the new Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. Forged in Africa, tempered in Pantelleria, and blooded in Sicily, the 12th was now put to the big test. Italy, no soft underbelly, was defended by at least 24 tough German divisions. We had 11. To balance the opposing forces, we mounted daily strikes to protect our tanks, to clear a path for our infantry. Although weather, terrain, and Nazis had finally stopped our armies, they never stopped us. There was no mud in the sky. Allied air power and Allied ground power had been welded into an effective team to defeat the enemy's greater forces. Our plan called for steady ground pressure to be synchronized with strong airstrikes. American airmen were taking off to buzz the Appian Way, the ancient highway trod by Caesar's triumphant legions of old. It was our job to open the rugged road to Rome. Blocking the way were minefields, occupied villages, protected by Nazi airdromes and Nazi tanks.
Resources at hand. Here was a network of rails and roads that had to be cut before our own troops, stymied on the narrow mountainous peninsula, could move. Even army mules had difficulty climbing Italy's rocky backbone. Allied forces, which now included some Italians, measured our advances in mountaintops instead of miles. San Pietro, like dozens of other German-held towns, was caught in a tight net of artillery fire. At times, our men felt they were on the long end of a forgotten front. But in spite of terrain, weather, and dug-in Nazis, the Fifth Army kept up the pressure. From village to village, from mountain to mountain, it was the same bitter action. Attacks and advances. They approached Cassino, gateway to Rome. This was one of those bitter moments born by war. High atop Monastery Hill in the Abbey of Monte Cassino, the godless Nazis had installed an observation post, and from there followed the movements of Allied soldiers below. Relying on the reluctance of the Allies to damage the Abbey, the Germans dominated the Liri Valley. From the sacred citadel itself, they tried to destroy the forces of freedom by directing concentrations of accurate and murderous fire. American Fifth Army artillery hammered back. Stalemated by the enemy's unique position, the road to Rome was blocked.
After weeks of investigation, including personal reconnaissance over Monte Cassino by Generals Acre and Devers, the Allies decided we would bomb and shell the Nazi-held town and abbey. For tactical reasons, Acre was opposed to the bombing. Instead, he favored using air to strangle enemy supply. But Allied leaders felt the continued sacrifice of our own men must stop. Everything else having failed, the Allies ordered air power to neutralize the Nazi observation post.
Worried Germans heard the first wave drone overhead. Like rabbits, the enemy darted into surrounding caves and tunnels carved into solid rock. Long prepared, their Gustav line pivoted on fortified Cassino, the town as well as the abbey, which the Germans had made a military target.
but the enemy survived the bombing. Fanatic, they still had the will to fight. Up from their tunnels, their bunkers, up into the ruins, their tough paratroopers quickly regrouped. In minutes, they reestablished their strong points. The Germans were back in business. Now, rubble as well as Nazis blocked the way.
Air leaders finally convinced everyone that the only way we could crack the Gustav line was to choke off the enemy's flow of supplies south of Rome. The operation was aptly named Strangle. In March, those of us flying for the 12th and 15th Air Forces began to deliver a series of blows against rail yards, tracks, trains, and bridges, especially bridges. In Italy, there were more than 40,000 bridges. Sanctuary, Operation Strangle was successful from the start. We hunted enemy trains and cut their lines in more than 100 places. Trucks and ships. We strangled enemy supply. On May 11th, we opened a new air and ground drive, a big one. We had the enemy on the run. 3 days later, our 5th Army cracked the Gustav line. It had taken 7 weeks to cut his main arteries and let enemy supply bleed to death. Mobility, the heart of German ground strength, was stymied. All his bridges were falling down. In the words of General Mark Clark, with the splendid effort of our Air Force, we put the enemy on the road.
Allied forces had triumphed at a price. Part of it, 9,000 airmen. But the road to Rome was open at last. There were cheers from grateful Romans for the weary men who had exploded through the tight enemy ring at Anzio's bloody beachhead. Now, after 9 months of brutal war, half of once Nazi-dominated Italy was free, and the Eternal City opened its arms. Out of Cassino and Operation Strangle came new lessons in the application of air power. In the forthcoming Prelude to the Normandy Invasion, you will see these hard-won lessons and tactics sharpened by the now campaign-wise United States Air Force.
United States Army bombers taking off just before dawn upon a mission of mercy. The plane of an American general with 14 of his crew is missing somewhere in the South Pacific. For 6 days, searching parties scour the ocean, the shark-infested waters of the Coral Sea. Suddenly, an observer signals that he sighted something, a mere speck down upon the ocean. He's right. It's a tiny, crowded rubber life raft, and another. The Army bomber cannot land on water, so the happy crew radios for the Navy. In a matter of hours, 2 flying boats are on the spot. An Army Air Force cameraman records the dramatic rescue. Heavily loaded, the giant Navy flying boats head for home. All hands aboard safe and uninjured. Back at the base, sunburned, starved, and blistered, the general and his men are carried ashore. A chocolate bar, a can of sardines, and a seagull was all the 15 men had to eat for 6 long days. Happy ending to what might have been another tragedy of the sea. The genius of the American automobile manufacturer, Henry Ford, turns to the mass production of gliders. Giant Army transport gliders made almost entirely of spruce and plywood. Wings are fitted as the finished ships move along an assembly line that never stops. Pilots to man the new silent fleets of invasion craft are constantly training. Each glider built to carry a striking force of men fully equipped for battle. The nose lifts up and a scout car complete with crew is taken aboard. Towed by a transport, the glider goes aloft. 3,000 pounds of motorless aircraft taking to the sky on its own wings. A ship nearly as large as a medium bomber. The pilot releases his line, cutting loose from the tow plane, and he's on his own. Down to earth for a perfect 3-point landing. Cargo and transport gliders proving their efficiency as new, swift, silent weapons of invasion. Flying with British and American pilots in pursuit of Rommel's fleeing Nazi forces, an Allied cameraman records an actual air attack over the desert. Attacking by sea as well as by land. An Axis supply ship is sighted heading for Tunisia. One more cargo of supplies that will never reach the Nazis as death rains from the sky. Flying high above a United Nations convoy somewhere in the Atlantic, Navy cameramen accompany patrol planes on the lookout for enemy submarines. Suddenly, a raider is sighted as it comes to the surface. By radio, word is flashed to an American aircraft carrier, and dive bombers are dispatched to the area. Guns blazing, the planes pounce upon the submarine before it can submerge. A second raider is sighted, and depth bombs are dropped, damaging the craft so severely it cannot escape. A dramatic photograph revealing a bomb in midair as the raider's crew crouches on deck. Two more submarines sent to the bottom. Naval Air Cadets, 1,000 miles from the sea, learn the technique of flying with the fleet. In battle formation, they take off for their floating base of operations on one of America's Great Lakes. Formerly the world's biggest side-wheel passenger steamer, she's now the training carrier Wolverine. Student pilots land and take off from her 550 feet flight deck under conditions identical to those at sea. An inland carrier training 10,000 new Navy fighter pilots a year. Bombers of the 8th United States Air Force, taking off from aerodromes in England, continue their round-the-clock devastation of war plants in Nazi Germany. In broad daylight, mighty squadrons roar across the North Sea. Over Hamburg, Germany's principal seaport and #1 war center, tons of bombs rain from the skies. Aerial photographs show the results. 7 square miles of Hamburg's war industries, docks, military installations, flattened and in ruins. Water mains, gas and electric plants destroyed. Hamburg as a war center, a base for submarines, is virtually wiped off the map. Battling their way home, machine gunners blast enemy fighter planes from the skies. The return of the squadrons. Jagged, gaping holes in many a bomber testify to the intensity of the futile Nazi defense. Even as a wounded Yankee gunner is borne from his ship, RAF ground crews are making ready night raiders to continue the assault. From more than 40 aerodromes, 800 giant bombers, Wellingtons, Liberators, Lancasters, Forts, take off to complete the destruction of the vital Nazi seaport. Again the signal, on target. And the city of Hamburg is fired by more bombs than fell on London in the 11 worst months of the Nazi air attacks. Australia, New Guinea, New Britain, vitally important Munda on New Georgia Island, come dramatic official films of the Allies' great sea and air offensive against the Japanese in the South Pacific. Planes over Kahili sight and bomb a Japanese cruiser. B-24s swarm over the Jap base at Lae on New Britain, breaking shore positions again and again. Enemy landing barges bringing reinforcements are machine-gunned out of the water. Over the shores of Munda, the bombers see American destroyers move in and bombard the big Japanese airfield on this vitally important island. The smoking shoreline reveals the effects of the naval bombardment. Working with precision and exactness in a coordinated attack, the destroyers now move out as medium and heavy bombers soften the way for the Allied troops advancing on land. Giant bomber unloading a never-ending cargo of death upon the enemy. Perhaps this is what President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill meant when they said decisions reached at the Quebec Conference would have a far-reaching effect in the war against Japan. Here is Allied air power, already smashing the outlying defenses of the Japanese Empire.